I'm Richard Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church, and your host for today's program, Austin Faith Dialogue. The feeding of the multitudes is a thought from Scripture that we've had a two-part series on, this being the second. Last week we looked at the direct help that's given toward alleviating world hunger. Today we look at another approach to that same goal of religious community, which is to help feed the multitude. Only now we're going to be looking at the ways this is done in terms of affecting public policy. We have with us, to help share in the thoughts on this, three persons related to an organization called Bread for the World, a faith-related group that seeks to influence those public policy makers that can release much more in the way of food to the world's needy beyond what we can do just by our own individual efforts. With us is Dick Hayne, who is the regional director for Bread for the World, located in Washington, as I understand now, Dick. And Judy Kostura, who is on the coordinating committee of the Bread for the World here in Austin. And then we have Art Simon, who is the executive director of Bread for the World. And we welcome you into our community. Again, Art, I understand you were here once before.
At least once.
And what brings you to town now?
Several stops. I'll be speaking to the Conference of Churches at a luncheon. Spent one day at Baylor. They had a hunger awareness week. So I spent a full day there and spoke at San Antonio.
So you're in Central Texas for a few days.
Yes.
And as you come to this particular part of the country and travel elsewhere, what is the main thrust of your message to people at the local level?
Well, my main message, I liked your two-part series, by the way, because it summarizes nicely what I say. My message is the solution to hunger walks on two legs.
Right.
One leg is direct private assistance. The other leg is public policy. And we've got to use both legs if we want to succeed. We happen to be a little better in the churches at using that direct assistance leg. That comes natural to us. Mm-hmm. We aren't so good at using the public policy leg. We have inhibitions there. And the track record is not so good, but we've got to move on policy matters if we're going to make progress against hunger.
Well, I think that's the one aspect of Bread for the World that, as I have had occasion to learn about it, is unique, that it puts the emphasis on being able to influence those decision makers with one vote making considerable difference disproportionately. And I'd like to come back to that after we have occasion, Judy, if we could, to have you tell us a little bit about the Austin chapter, and can you give us a kind of a typical month or, series of events that can give us this microcosm here in Austin?
Yes, there are 145 members in the local district chapter of Bread for the World, which is based on congressional districts. We're District 10, and there's a steering committee of which I and 4 or 5 other people meet roughly once a month, every 2 or 3 months, depending on what types of events are being planned for Bread for the World members. A typical event that was planned and carried out was a hunger banquet for the World Food Day observance last year, where Bread for the World, in conjunction with Austin Peace and Justice Coalition and other organizations, planned with donated food, cooked it by Bread for the World members, served it to other people, a hunger banquet where members of the community were invited to partake either of very small portions representing what most of the world eats, medium-sized portions for a smaller group of people, and then very sumptuous meals. We had donated cheesecakes, chocolate cakes,
So, right in the same room, you get people recreating the distribution or maldistribution of food around the world.
Those with, yes, small portions sat on the floor. Mm-hmm. Those with the very nice meals that Americans and Austinites are used to eating. Had tablecloths, crystal, donated roses on the table.
Well, now, did you have revolution breaking out in that room?
In a sense you wouldn't expect. Most of the people were more comfortable either wanting to share, which was nice. It was not something that we programmed, but people did want to share, or they were more comfortable going and sitting on the floor and having rice and broth in the face of, until we got to the cheesecake.
I see. I see. And then their Christian ethic broke down a little bit at that point?
It was a popular item.
Uh-huh. All right.
Which table did you sit at?
I served. Didn't have to face those decisions.
Well, I've heard of that. It's a kind of, I suppose you'd say, a game that brings home the realities to people that just words wouldn't.
We did, and we tried to emphasize that by having members of the local food bank, Capital Area Food Bank, present to distribute literature and speak afterwards. An organization, Sedan, which does community nutrition education, were present, and the funds raised by the meal were divided evenly between those two organizations, with also a donation to the church that hosted the event.
I see. Well, I think that we'll have occasion to come back and hear more of the local expression of that concern. But Dick, we welcome you back to Texas. I understand you taught at TCU, Bright Divinity School.
That's correct, 17 years.
And you went off to Washington to do this work as a regional organizer, so would it be fair to say that you're sort of in between Judy and Art in terms of the local and the national?
Yes, I try to travel, to be present in the area here, to help Judy and the other members in any way that I can, perhaps to work with judicatory officials or speak at local churches, or we might have leadership training events or workshops to help the people here in Austin to develop their advocacy style and to be more effective advocates for public policy. I'm based in Washington, and I travel about 2 to 3 months out of the year. My entire region includes Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma.
I see. So at this particular time, you're helping escort Art around from one place to the other?
Yes, I'm his wheels, and I'm getting to coast a bit, actually. He is having to do most of the speaking, and I just kind of hang around and lay out materials and meet a few folks.
He's memorizing my speech.
Yes, yes. I am indeed, as a matter of fact.
Well, we'll try to have Art say something today that you haven't heard before. But first of all, let's go back, Art, to something that you may have expressed before, but I would be interested in having you share this with the Austin audience. I think some folks looking in today may not have heard of Bread for the World. I've read your book that I understand you first put out in the 1976, was it?
I think so.
And then the most recent edition in '84.
Correct.
But in both versions, recalling how it was in 1972 that there were some initial discussions among some people that you were with in New York, and that by '74 the organization had started, and here we are 14 years later, and you've got regional directors, for heaven's sakes. I mean, how did that happen? How many members now?
40,000 members nationwide.
All right, and how many regional, just to get the organizational sense of it?
About a dozen. How many?
Well, it's kind of hard to count because, you know, they're in and out of the office. They're on the road. We have meetings, and sometimes there are 9 there and as many as 15 or 17.
Okay, now that's at the regional level. How many counterparts of organizations like Judy belongs to here do you have locally across the nation?
Several hundred. I don't know what the exact figure would be, but there would be several hundred.
Okay, now you've not only multiplied Lowe's in that 14 years, you've multiplied an organization.
Correct.
And that's a fast start. That's it's a phenomenon. Now, how do you account for that?
Basically, I think the idea of Bread for the World makes sense. It's a simple idea. The idea is that get people in the churches who care about hungry people, who want to do something, to write to the decision makers, let their opinions be heard, and in that way bring about policy changes that are going to make a difference.
Okay. So there's an intrinsic appeal to the idea.
I think so. I mean, clearly, I am not a genius at organizing. My charisma level is probably, 50 or 60 points below that of Bush or Dukakis. And yet it keeps growing,
Your charisma level keeps growing?
No. Bread for the World keeps growing. I wish the charisma level grew.
His modesty level is very high.
Okay, well, so it's not by dint of just one overwhelming personality that this has come about.
Clearly, that is not the case.
All right. And it's the idea whose time has come, in a sense.
I think so.
All right. I'm just wondering, in terms of the very nature of what you're doing in regard to, writing your congressman or whoever else that you know that can influence policy questions, seems controversial. I mean, you're asking them to support certain legislation, certain actions of a public sort that you could have divisions of opinion about, whether that was liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican. How do you gather your numbers when it could be divisive in its approach?
Well, basically, we are nonpartisan, and we don't have an ideological approach to things. We're very pragmatic or practical in that sense, trying to find commonsensical solutions to a very real human problem. And that appeals to people from very different backgrounds. I would say the element of controversy that enters has more to do with the reluctance of Christians to relate faith to public policy concerns. I think they confuse the separation of church and state with the separation of religion and life.
Okay, religion and politics don't mix.
Don't mix,
yeah. Common perception.
And there's a core of truth to that. And precisely because there is a core of truth, it's very appealing, but it oversimplifies and misleads people to think that there are vast arenas of life having to do with social and economic matters that affect all of us very greatly, that somehow are off limits to faith, and that can't be the way.
Well, now, Judy, you're an attorney. Do you not feel that you've got a separation of church and state issue to contend with here?
I have a very healthy respect for the separation between church and state, but as a lawyer I also have a very healthy respect for advocacy, and believe that in the Old Testament we see many examples of God as an advocate for widows, orphans, the homeless, sojourners in a strange land, giving instruction to people to leave food in the field for the gleaners. And if you read the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, there are very mighty passages by the prophets on what God requires in the way of justice and the way you treat other people. And there's no conflict between, in fact, there is a mandate, in my opinion, to implement justice as part of your Christian faith.
All right, so what you're saying then, even from a legal standpoint, that you not only have the conviction that church and state are not in hermeneutically sealed compartments, they are interacting, but that from at least the religious community standpoint, you've got the justice issue that makes advocacy an indispensable expression of faith.
Yes.
And I'd like to, just in terms of some of the material that I've had opportunity to read that you've prepared, Art, come back to some examples. The emergency famine aid, this was after the Cambodian crisis, African food crisis, I guess particularly the African in 83.
That had to do with the African famine.
All right, and it said that An avalanche of Bread for the World member letters in '85, combined with sudden media attention, resulted in congressional approval of $800 million in food and emergency famine assistance. In one single vote, Congress had provided more funds for Africa famine relief that year than would be raised by all private efforts combined. And that struck me because I'm thinking now not only of feeding the multitudes, I'm thinking of multiplication of the loaves. That one vote could make that kind of difference. And can you give other examples of where that principle operates?
Yes, we have examples each year of how letters to members of Congress from Bread for the World people have been able to bring about actions that have had a great impact on. Let me just give one other illustration. In 1984, we proposed legislation for establishing a child survival fund. The idea of that fund was to promote the use of some very simple techniques toward better nutrition and disease prevention that are inexpensive, but in developing countries can bring down that awfully high death rate among infants and young children. So the letters came into Congress. Congress established the fund, voted an initial $25 million for it. We asked for 50, we got 25, but we continue to work on it. The next 2 years, that amount tripled to $75 million. Then we quit working on it because our judgment was that the momentum was going and the support was there, and we could pick up another issue. Congress in last year increased that to $80 million, and this year Congress has just voted an appropriation level for child survival of $100 million. Now, okay, the clincher is, what does $100 million for child survival do? Well, Jim Grant, the director of UNICEF, has said that for every $100 spent on child survival, one child's life is saved. Now, if you apply that formula to the current level, $100 million, we're talking about 1 million kids who will live rather than die from 1 year's funding alone, and that's 25 children for every Bread for the World member. The letters really make a difference.
So when you translate that in terms of actually saving lives, and you can convert so many dollars appropriated by Congress you can correlate that with the lives that are saved, then it ceases to be just a statistic or an abstraction. And I think that's helpful to note. And I'd like, if we could, Dick, just in terms of your coming back to Austin or this part of Texas, what, for instance, we just heard Art speak of, would you get questions like, well, isn't that a Democratic proposed bill, or maybe a Republican proposed bill? Is it, do you find the partisan question coming up in your travels?
It does, and particularly in an election year. One of the many things I like about Bread for the World, I'm relatively new on staff, just having come on the 1st of February, is the conviction throughout the staff, from the top to the bottom, that hunger issues are not Democratic issues or Republican issues or independent issues, or for that matter, Baptist, Lutheran, Catholic, Presbyterian, but they are human issues, and that people of good heart and people of goodwill exist in all of those groups. And that I would be reluctant to say that any group has a kind of monopoly on good public policy, such that some other group has no wisdom to bring to bear to it. So it's very pleasing to us to see that often when we draft and offer a bill, that the co-sponsors will be from both parties, both Democrat and Republican. And we are very, very committed to a nonpartisan stance, and do it in good conscience because of the way we understand the issue and the pragmatic solutions that are necessary to arrive at
And do you find that the representatives working with you tend to be pretty evenly divided between both parties?
I've never added it up, but I do know, and I suspect it varies depending upon the particular piece of legislation at hand. But I know that even, say, a given representative may be with us on some issues and against us on other issues, so that whether Democrat or Republican. So a lot of that divides out by particular issue rather than, say, necessarily across party lines.
Okay.
I would say, for example, on the Child Survival Bill or on the famine relief for Africa, there were a pretty even representation from both parties. Given the fact that there are more Democrats in Congress than Republicans, you have to take that into account. But it was clearly a bipartisan support that we developed.
Well, I'd like to also look at it from the standpoint of the way it brings together not only people from political parties, but across the spectrum of religious communities. Is this what you might call Bread for the World strictly a mainline denomination-supported group, or do you have others that are, and is it limited to Christians and so on?
Well, we are a Christian citizens movement. We don't limit it to anybody. I mean, the doors are open to Jews, to people of other faiths, or people of no faith persuasion.
Have others come in through those
and
doors?
others come in, sure.
Right.
But we do define ourselves and understand ourselves as a Christian movement, so naturally we appeal more to people who are in the churches.
Well, now, I have had, I believe it was in your book, you're mentioning the head of the World Vision that has worked with you and supported your work from the evangelical community, and is that pretty representative of across the board? Or?
Yes, we have Catholics. The head of our board currently is Father William J. Byron, who's president of Catholic University of America. We have Southern Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians and people from just about every denomination you could imagine involved in Bread for the World at various levels.
You had a quote in your book about being born, not just born again, but born again twice. Could you expound on that just a bit from a theological standpoint? I'm intrigued by that.
Dick is laughing because he heard this illustration too often.
Okay.
When I was a seminary intern in New York, working in New York, I heard an Indian theologian by the name of D.T. Niles preach on John 3:16. And in that sermon he said, Christians must be twice converted people.
Oh, I see.
First converted from the world to Christ. But then he said, we must be converted again to the world, to love the world, not as before, but now through the heart and the mind of Christ. And of course, I like to think of Bread for the World's work as being part of that second conversion.
Back to the world.
That's right.
All right. So that's not original with you? But
Not original with me, I regret to say.
We don't mind using other people's material.
Okay, I think it's a terrific way of perceiving it. And there's another one that, Dick, maybe you could respond to about the Chinese proverb about if you give a person a fish, you feed the person for a day, and what the rest of that is?
Well, and if you teach them how to fish, they will be able to feed themselves, or something like that. I
For a
can't quote it.
lifetime,
Yeah,
something of that sort.
Can't quote it directly.
That's not original.
No, that isn't. Yes, the one along that line that I've heard Art speak about was, now I'm quoting Art, quoting his father, that when he grew up in Wisconsin, his father used to say that it's better to put a fence at the top of the cliff than be continuously driving an ambulance back and forth from the bottom of the cliff. And it's a similar kind of point that you try to change the structures and the processes that create poverty and hunger, so that and enable people to be self-sufficient rather than in the position of dependency, a position that people really don't like to be in. Again, that's really a core thing that we do work on. We do work on funding for emergency famine relief, say in Africa, but the larger project and that we are always focusing on is how to change those structures so that people are enabled to feed themselves, enabled to have a sense of dignity and self-worth, and not be continuously dependent on handouts, whether in this country because we have a domestic agenda, or whether in third world countries for our international agenda.
And to get more at the causes rather than just
That's
dealing
right.
with the symptoms.
To deal with the causes.
And one way of dealing with the causes, I would presume, Judy, is in terms of this letter writing campaign. I understand that you've brought just something for us to take a look at as well as to listen to your interpretation of.
Well, one of our local members, Beverly Gerard, did what I think is a wonderful sign, very eye-catching. And we used it during the Crop Walk, which is an annual event here in Austin. Our churches are very good about turning out little children in strollers being wheeled around, to older folks, dogs, cats, no cats, dogs, dogs on leashes. We have quite a good turnout every year, and Bread for the World, as part of its contribution, sets up letter writing or postcard writing stations at the last 2 of the 3 rest stops.
Okay.
We bring pre-printed, pre-addressed, pre-stamped postcards.
So that makes it easy to do, and it seems to me also in terms of covenant churches that sign on with you to help take part in either crop walks or within their own church to be an advocate. And I think that as a way of saying thank you for your being with us, Dick and Judy and Art, that I'd like to indicate that as a Lutheran clergyman, Art, I believe that was your denomination,
That's right.
that you bring to us an ecumenical, interfaith message that we very much appreciate. We'd like to thank you for watching today, our most recent episode of Austin Faith Dialogue, and next week we'll be turning to pastoral care as an issue, moving from a multiplying of the loaves and the feeding of the multitude to the feeding of persons very close to home in our own community, in terms of the